the week after the data sessions, right? So it's a big hello to freedom and to relief, right? From your perspective, at least those who suffered tremendously in the data session. No, honestly, we know that it wasn't easy for all of you, but as we said several times, we will get there. Francisca, Constellation, myself, we will give you another opportunity to talk about your assignment next week Wednesday. Okay? Next week Wednesday from 2 to 4. It's already in your schedules, and I will communicate this tomorrow on Toledo. So next week Wednesday, everybody, please, everybody come to talk about the assignment next week Wednesday. The week after the data sessions is also a beautiful and wonderful week because we are actually starting and continuing with our guest lectures in the course Human Rights and Rule of Law in Europe and Beyond. And today is a special day because we have a very good colleague with us, actually a colleague who has until a couple of years ago worked with us here in Leuven. It's a great pleasure to have Dr. Matthieu Burnay with us, who is a senior lecturer at Queen Mary University, London, teaching global Chinese law, as you can see here on the slide. Matthieu and me have shared an office here in Leuven for quite some time, and we have published together, and we are still working on a number of projects together, such as the EU Cross Jean Monnet Network, or as well the EU Planned Jean Monnet Network, which is a network that Matthieu runs at Queen Mary University that is basically looking into the crossroads, if you like, of European and Chinese law in a globalized world. Matthieu Burnay's research interests are global law and governance, and he has increasingly looked into the question of human rights and the rule of law in China. He does this in a very unique way, as you will see during his lecture. Not only is his way of teaching quite extraordinary, but also the different perspectives which he brings in. It is by training. He did a master's degree at the London School of Economics and Beijing University. He focused on the history of EU-China relations, but he is also bringing in a law perspective. He has his degree, his PhD, from the Faculty of Law here at the University of Leuven, and he has also a political science perspective because of his prior education at Saint Louis University in Brussels. Now, all of this together make Matthieu Burnay very unique and just the perfect lecturer for an interdisciplinary course like this today. So a big round of applause for Matthieu Burnay and his lecture on China under Xi, national and transnational implications. I should tell you, this lecture will be recorded in the EU Cross Network. It will be available on the website any day soon, thanks to the help of Kevin, Alex, and Wei Yang, who are here. And last but not least, sorry Matthieu, because otherwise I forget about it, we have Marta Hermes here with us, who is actually teaching the course Chinese law from a European perspective in the second semester. And she is wondering why no students from Mars have signed up for this course. Now, if you are still interested in signing up for this course, you know there is a little window of opportunity at the beginning of the second semester to change your ISP. Take these 3 extra ECTS. I tell you it's worth it, because there are a number of guest lecturers and professors from China teaching in this course, and of course Marta herself. Okay, Matthieu, it's up to you.
Thank you so much, Kolja, for this far too generous introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. It's always a pleasure to be back here in Leuven, to my alma mater. It's not the first time that I get to intervene in this course, and I'm truly grateful to Kolja for the very kind invitation. My idea this afternoon is to spend some time, giving you some information, but I would like to make sure that we have time for debate at the end of the lecture. If nevertheless you feel that you have any kind of burning question in the middle of my presentation, really don't hesitate to intervene and to interrupt me throughout my lecture, whose title today is China under Xi, National and Transnational Implications for the Rule of Law and Human Rights. You can think, wow, that's quite a broad title, that's quite overambitious, and my answer is yes, this is overambitious. So that's why, in my lecture here, I would like not only, to give you some kind of general information on changes which are currently occurring in China, because that will be the main message, of this presentation, that is that China is indeed changing under Xi Jinping, not only in terms of domestic policies, but also in terms of China's foreign policy. And these changes do have a significant impact on the meaning of the rule of law and human rights domestically within China, but also in the different ways in which China shapes the international discourses on the rule of law and human rights. So this will be, let's say, for the more general considerations in the first part of my presentation. And then I would like to kind of narrow down the focus slightly to look at two factors which I think really shape deeply the way human rights and the rule of law are understood in China these days, or more particularly, how human rights and the rule of law are actually violated within China these days, by looking at two different factors. First of all, the way China defines, the concept of citizenship. Citizenship, which is which is usually understood from the European perspective as underpinning certain rights, right? This is very much within the European Union a rights-based approach towards citizenship. And as we will see in the context of this presentation, we will not only see that the basic rights which are supposed to be attached to citizenship in China are not only violated on a regular basis, but we will also see that the very notion, the very concept of citizenship remains very much contested in China. Then I would also like to talk about something which is quite fancy, I must say. There are more and more lawyers who tend to work on the link between law and technology. And China is quite interesting in that regard. China is now heading this kind of fair towards digital transformation. I'm sure that many of you have read articles in the news on this social rating, on this so-called social rating system, and the idea will be to look here at some of those developments, some of the developments of this so-called digital transformation now taking place in China, focusing in particular on the implications from the perspective of the rule of law and the perspective of human rights. So this is a little bit the menu for this afternoon. We'll see where it gets us, and it will definitely get us to a Q&A session at the end. So the first point which I would like to make here is the fact that China is changing, and it should not be it should not emerge as any kind of surprise for those of you who follow, the official rhetoric of the Chinese Communist Party, in the sense that back in 2017, at the occasion of the National Plenum of the Chinese Communist Party, President Xi Jinping made it clear that the so-called socialism with Chinese characteristics has now entered a new era. And the purpose of this lecture is, among many other things, to try to highlight what this new era actually means from the perspective of the rule of law and human rights. It is clear that China is at a turning point. China is at a turning point internally, simply because there are many, many challenges which need to be resolved. And it is clear that new recipes need to be invented to address all those challenges. Challenges which relate primarily, or among many other things, to the relationship between economics and politics. What is the future of political reforms in China after a few decades of fast economic growth while still maintaining a one-party state? There is a need in a certain way to address, this relationship, this tension between political reforms on the one side, or the lack thereof, and economic development on the other side. How to make this rapid economic growth sustainable? We are not here talking of whether people vote for a Green Party or do not vote for a Green Party. We are talking about the question of whether Chinese people will be able to walk down the street in the future without wearing a mask. In the big Chinese cities, which are so much, impacted by air pollution. We are also talking about, income inequalities. income disparities between the coastal areas and the more remote areas of China. In that sense, I mean, the presidency of the former Chinese president, Hu Jintao, is very often referred to as the lost decade. The decade during which, I mean, income disparities have not been sufficiently addressed. And the question is here again, how China can kind of address those inequalities and those income inequalities issues. Externally, the world is changing. I mean, there is a growing consensus on the fact that the post-World War II liberal international order is at least in a state of transition, not to say in a deep state of crisis. This crisis has a number of dimensions. Crisis of legitimacy, the fact that the global governance architecture no longer represents, I mean, the actual balance of power. Global governance architecture, which is still largely based upon the balance of power, which was the one at the end of the Second World War, but also a substantive legitimacy crisis. The fact that the very values at the heart of this post-World War II liberal international order, such as democracy, rule of law, and human rights, are not only contested from the outside, from the perspective of a number of authoritarian states, but also from the inside. And I guess I don't need to explain that to European studies students who know, I mean, the situation, the ongoing developments in Hungary, Poland, and Romania way better than I do, where we see that the kind of contestation against values such as the rule of law, we are talking about rule of law backsliding, or against democracy, we are talking about democratic recession. These are developments which testify to the fact that those values are indeed not only contested from the outside, but also from the very inside. Other aspect of the crisis is obviously this crisis of effectiveness. The fact that the global governance architecture or the global governance system has hardly been able to respond effectively to a number of global challenges. Climate change, migration crisis, war in Syria, you name them, right? And the big question is, what is China doing out of that? What is China doing out of this key turning point in Chinese politics for the internal dimension? And what is China doing out of these gaps, which are very much left in a context in which the US is very much retreating from multilateralism, in a context in which the US is very much retreating from this post-World War II liberal international order. So let's just look briefly at a number of developments within China first. So how is China responding to this kind of turning point in its own history? What does this new era stand for domestically within China? The first point which I would like to make here is that this new era, I mean, is characterized by an increased concentration of power. China has been based upon a one-party state system since the establishment of the People's Republic of China back in 1949, but it is clear that in the last few years we have very much seen a departure from a consensus-based political decision system towards a concentration of power. Concentration of power, I mean, within one stream of the Chinese Communist Party, which is the one which is led by Xi Jinping. The point here is not to say that the party had disappeared at all from China's governance system, but what we do witness these days is what you could call a repartyization of Chinese politics. The fact that the party really comes back to the forefront of every single issue which is currently faced in Chinese society. To kind of characterize or illustrate this enhanced concentration of power, I mean, I guess that many of you will not have missed the fact that back in March 2018, you had a reform, you had an amendment made to the Chinese constitution, which was putting an end to this limit to 2 mandates of Chinese presidencies, which means that in theory, I mean, Xi Jinping would be able to remain president for life. I'm saying in theory because personally I think that it is unlikely, even if it is likely indeed that Xi Jinping will go on for at least one more mandate after this one. Another, I mean, element which I would like to mention here are also changes from within the Chinese legal system. We've seen, I mean, a number of laws, I mean, which have deeply shaped the evolution of the Chinese legal system, which have been adopted in the last few years. And all these laws, I mean, include an important provision protecting the so-called national interests. National interest can mean many things, right? And it can mean many things, more particularly when you are under a one-party state. And it is very clear in that regard that the focus on national interests in a number of laws, which range from the 2015 National Security Law, the 2016 Cybersecurity Law, the 2016 Law on the activities on foreign NGOs, which are now going through an increasingly difficult process to be active in China. We are talking about, obviously human rights NGOs, but also environmental NGOs. And in a certain way, obviously, all those new laws also have a very impact on the meaning, on the nature, on the role played by the law in Chinese society. While in 2013, there was a little bit this narrative or this hope that China would indeed take the direction of the rule of law, because the rule of law narrative was used very much, at the occasion of the 2013 plenum of the Chinese Communist Party. What we have witnessed, quite in opposition to that since 2013, is what can be described as a turn against the law. The fact that, a substantive understanding of the law, a law that would signify a certain ideal of justice, is increasingly seen as a threat. Is increasingly seen as a threat from the perspective of the one-party state. And the last point which I would like to make here is that we've seen also, the party state become increasingly vocal against the promotion of universal values. Universal values, civil society, so-called Western ideas of constitutionalism, all those issues can hardly be discussed in China these days. It is not to say that China was endorsing, the human rights discourse prior to 2015 or prior to 2014, but at least there was a space. There was still a space, for instance, for human rights advocacy, for human rights lawyering to take place. What we've seen in the last few years, and more particularly since July 2015, are a series of crackdowns. A series of crackdowns against not people who are revolutionaries in China, sometimes just university professors. Some university professors indeed emphasizing a more liberal understanding of what a constitution actually means. Not reinventing the Chinese constitution, just pointing towards the specific provisions included in the Chinese constitution and asking for those rights, which are numerous in the Chinese constitution, to be implemented and to be respected. So to kind of package or to bring together, those different considerations which I've made here, I just would like to refer to a very good book which was published by a law professor from Fordham Law School in the US, Carl Minzner, who argued in a book published by OUP back in 2018 that we would witness today an authoritarian revival in China. Not to say that authoritarianism have left China, but just to say that we see here a revival of authoritarianism, a revival which would mark the end of this reform process. Reform process which was started by Deng Xiaoping at the end of the 1970s, and a reform process which meant that China was opening up to the rest of the world, opening up economically and not that much politically. Now, what about the external dimension? China is changing internally. Externally, it is very clear that the old mantra of Chinese foreign policy, namely this idea of keeping a low profile, has been very much abandoned. During many years, when at the beginning of the opening up and process policy by Deng Xiaoping, or until the presidency of Hu Jintao, there was very much this idea of observing calmly, holding one's ground, responding soberly, and getting some things done. The idea for China was to keep a kind of low-profile foreign policy. This doctrine has now completely been abandoned, not only in the rhetoric of the Chinese Communist Party, but also very much in the practice. By practice, I'm referring here more particularly to the numerous attempts by China to enhance its so-called discourse power. By discourse power, I'm referring here to these concepts by the French political philosopher Michel Foucault, who argued that language is power. That if you are indeed able to shape the language used in international affairs, it means that you've been able to increase your influence. And this is something that China has very much understood. If indeed China has to have a stronger voice in global governance, if China is to have a more efficient foreign policy, it is important for China to shape the language used in the main international fora. And you see me here, you see me coming here. I mean, one of the main narratives which has been used, I mean, in that context, is this famous Belt and Road Initiative. Belt and Road Initiative, which has been described, I mean, by someone whose name I cannot remember, sorry for that, as one of the biggest marketing strategy, I mean, in the history. Because the Belt and Road Initiative is actually primarily about marketing. I mean, when you look at the number of projects which have been, I mean, implemented, if you consider the fact that many of the projects now falling under the label of the Belt and Road Initiative were projects which were already on the pipeline, which were already projects before 2013, before Xi Jinping came with this idea of the Belt and Road Initiative. Just in a few words, the Belt and Road Initiative is about one thing: connectivity. The idea is to enhance China's connectivity, not only with, I mean, through a maritime route connecting the Chinese province of Yunnan towards Southeast Asia, South Asia, Africa, and then back to Europe, but also by a land route, I mean, connecting China with Europe, going through Central Asia. Connectivity which can be, I mean, achieved through massive investments, more particularly in infrastructure. China has been quite successful in promoting that narrative. I mean, I was discussing with a colleague, I mean, over lunch, the fact that indeed it took quite some years for the European Union to respond in a certain way to that project. I mean, the EU and China have now established a so-called connectivity platform, which aims to kind of connect, I mean, China's Belt and Road Initiative with the EU's, I mean, own infrastructure and investment projects in the eastern neighborhood and also in the southern neighborhood. But let's say that the EU has been very much reactive in a certain way to this initiative made by China, this so-called Belt and Road Initiative, which is, I think, a good example of indeed this idea of China's trying to enhance its discourse power and this idea of China becoming increasingly active in its foreign policy. In practice, I mean, we've seen also China trying to restructure, to reform, I mean, the global governance architecture. We are talking here about, I mean, reforming certain institutions from the inside, but we've also seen China becoming increasingly active in becoming a norms shaper or even a norms maker. I mean, when China was still in this position of a patient learner, was still in this position of having a quiet foreign policy, China was very much of a kind of norms taker in global affairs. And now what we see is that China is becoming increasingly active in shaping norms and in making norms. If you are interested into, I mean, those specific aspects, I would strongly recommend you to look at what China is doing in the global governance of the commons. The commons, from Arctic governance to, I mean, the high seas, to outer space. I mean, outer space and space law in one of those is one of those areas of governance where you see China together with Russia being extremely active in proposing new codes of conduct in a context in which outer space remains very much under-regulated. So we see there China becoming increasingly active in making new norms, but also in putting forward its own interpretation of existing norms. And I would like here to refer more particularly to a declaration which was adopted back in 2017, which is the so-called Beijing Declaration on Human Rights, a declaration which was signed by China and a number of developing countries, putting forward a specific interpretation of human rights with a very strong focus on the right to development. So you see there also a kind of attempt to shape the human rights discourse using that language, but still putting forward China's own interpretation of the concept. So this is the kind of general framework which I wanted to present to you today. Now let me dig a little bit into two factors which I think very much shape not only those domestic developments which I have highlighted, but also, I mean, policies or factors which have deep transnational implications. And by transnational implications, I also mean implications from the perspective of the EU. So here I will try as much as I can, not only to look at the way China evolves internally, but also to look at the different ways in which those developments have an influence from the perspective of the EU member states and the European Union. The first factor which I would like to talk about here is citizenship. Citizenship with Chinese characteristics, or looking at the way citizenship is defined within China. The point that I would like to make here is twofold. On the one side, I would like to put forward the fact that citizen rights and obligations are regularly violated in China. That's one point. But also that Chinese citizenship is very much fragmented. And that will be the first point which I will try to make here, that is to explain what can be meant by this fragmentation of Chinese citizenship. Fragmentation which has different components. First of all, depending on the place where you were born, you will have different rights. I will talk here about the household registration system, or the so-called hukao system, which has a significant impact on the actual rights you can access, depending on whether you were born in the countryside or whether you were born in cities. I would like here to talk also the fragmentation which is linked to the ethnic division within China, looking more particularly at some ethno-religious minorities, the Tibetans and the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, looking at the different ways in which, the specific rights of some of those minority groups are significantly violated in China these days. But I would like also here to look at the potential, or the existing, or I should say the shrinking avenues for activists to protect the rights which are supposed to be attached to citizenship. For the simple reason that this activism to protect those rights attached to citizenship do lead to an even stronger fragmentation, which means that human rights advocacy can lead you into very, very difficult positions and can lead you to a point where your rights as a citizen, as a Chinese citizen, are no longer respected. And last but not least, here I would like to talk about what I would call the external dimension of Chinese citizenship. And more particularly here, I would like to talk about extradition treaties, or the different ways in which the party state is now trying to reach out towards those it defines as Chinese outside Chinese borders. And we will see that different EU member states will have different responses. Some EU member states have a long-standing tradition of extraditions with China. Some others are way more careful. And we'll see here that a number of courts, have made interesting rulings in the last few months on relating to extraditions towards China, highlighting the fact that such extraditions would actually violate the European Convention on Human Rights. So this is what I would like to do in the context of this case study here. So let's now try to get into the more details. The first point that I would like to make here is that citizenship until the early 20th century was a foreign concept to China. Citizenship is a concept, as a notion, was introduced in China at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, which is still described by China today as being the heart of the century of humiliation. This is indeed during those years that China, not only that the Qing dynasty, which was still in power at the time, the Qing dynasty lost, the Opium Wars against the British Empire, 1840, 1842. China also lost at the time a war against France, 1884, 1885. And most importantly, China also lost, the first Sino-Japanese War, which was between 1894 and 1895. Obviously, there were some reactions to all these defeats. And a significant reaction to this defeat was the question of how to make China stronger, how to create a feeling of belonging to a nation within the Chinese population. And it is very much in that context, against this background, that one should situate the transplantation of the concept of citizenship within China. And it is quite important here, because we can see that from the very beginning, the idea of introducing, the idea of talking about citizenship in China was not meant to create rights. We're not talking here about a rights-based approach towards citizenship, but we're rather talking about citizenship as a tool to create a nation state, to make the nation stronger. Nevertheless, and China is not unique in that regard, we've also seen some spillover effects. The fact that the very introduction of that notion of citizenship did open the space for liberal reforms and for some debates on certain values such as human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. And the reason why I wanted to talk about these developments at the end of the 19th century or 20th century is simply because this kind of dynamic is still taking place in China today. The very concept of citizenship is there to make the nation strong, not to create rights, but at the same time it opened the space for rights advocacy and for the promotion of a more liberal agenda within China. When we think of, Chinese citizenship, as I said earlier, the first point which I would like to make, which relates to the internal dimension of Chinese citizenship, is that Chinese citizenship remains very much fragmented. Actually, when we are talking about Chinese citizenship as entailing some rights, we are referring to only a part of the population, and more particularly to urban citizenship. Actually, you need really in practice to be, a citizen living in a city, or someone who has been able to move, by law or in respect of the law from the countryside to the city, to be able to enjoy certain rights. Indeed, if you were not lucky enough, to be born in the countryside, if you have a hukou, which is one of the countryside, you cannot decide the next day just like this, oh, I want to work in the city and benefit, from all the good rights which the city has to offer. By rights, I'm referring here to access to public schools. I'm referring here to public hospitals, for instance. This is why, we are talking about those so-called migrant workers. Those people who keep going from the countryside to the city, to work in the city. This population of migrant workers, for many of them, are described as a kind of floating population. A floating population standing between rural areas and urban areas. This floating population is made of people, of citizens, who have not been granted permanent official household registration in the place where they are currently residing. So we are talking of someone who was born in the countryside, who moved to Beijing, who moved to Shanghai, but without having the rights to actually benefit from the different social rights attached to the very fact of living in that city. I'm not talking about an anecdote here. Back in 2016, some data did show that we were talking actually at the time about as many as 250 million Chinese actually being in that position. 250 million Chinese, including 60 million children. 60 million children will be affected in two different ways. Either they will be left by their parents in the countryside and hence won't have access to good schools, to good public schools, or will move together with their parents towards the cities and will have access to some private schools, which are for many of them illegal and which will hence not be of a higher standard. So we see here this kind of fragmentation at play, right? We are not talking about Chinese citizenship coming out as a whole. We see that Chinese citizenship tend to be fragmented in the sense that people will have different access to certain rights or basic social services depending on their household registration. This is one aspect of this fragmentation. Another aspect of this fragmentation relates to, the distinction between different ethnic minorities. Actually, the Chinese constitution does recognize the existence of 55 minority nationalities. One of them is made of the so-called Han Chinese, which is the majority of the Chinese people belong to this ethnic minority. We are talking about 92% of the Chinese population, I would say, overall. And then you have indeed 54 other minorities. Quite interestingly, I mean, the distinction between these 55 minority groups was made back in 1954, so quite some time ago, in a process which was called the Ethnic Classification Project, which can be criticized on many grounds in the sense that the distinctions which were made at the time did tend to be artificial from the perspective of a number of minority groups. So we are in certain contexts, in certain circumstances, talking about, I mean, a more kind of artificial creation. And the very point which I would like to make here is that this whole process of making a distinction between a majority ethnic group and minority ethnic groups, I mean, should not hide the fact that overall, I mean, the perspective or the objective of the party state has been to construct a political, pan-Chinese, non-ethnic identity. So beyond the recognition of this diversity, there has been very much this idea of creating a sense of Chineseness. The idea of making sure that we would be talking about a citizenship which would fit with the Chinese socialist model with Chinese characteristics. And this is very much against that background that one should situate in particular developments which have been taking place in certain regions of China, such as Tibet and such as Xinjiang. Tibet and Xinjiang are two regions of China where you have, I mean, a significant presence of ethno-religious minorities, which are primarily made of Buddhist Tibetans, Uyghurs, Kazakh, and other Muslim populations. And the least that we can say is that, I mean, the integration of those two regions, I mean, namely Tibet and Xinjiang, into the Chinese model of development has not been easy from the very beginning. We've had difficulties, for instance, for those two regions to really benefit directly from, I mean, the economic model which has been put in place in China since 1979 and the beginning of the opening up and reforms process. But this should not hide, obviously, I mean, a number of policies which have been adopted, more particularly in a context in which some of those minority groups have been defined or has been identified, and here I do weigh my words, as a biological threat. As a biological threat against the one-party system, against this idea of creating a political pan-Chinese, non-ethnic identity. I mean, these regions, I mean, still make the headlines. I mean, we are not really talking about Tibet these days, but back in 2008, I mean, there were many debates on the situation in Tibet with self-immolation cases. I think Xinjiang is more under the spotlight these days because Xinjiang has become a huge living laboratory. I mean, when I talk about Xinjiang, just to show you here on the map, we are actually talking about China's largest province, which actually borders quite a number of Central Asian states. It's not only a region which is important from geopolitical reasons, being neighboring, I mean, a number of states from Pakistan and a number of states in Central Asia, but we are also talking about a province which is extremely rich in natural resources. So this is, I mean, a region which is critically important from the perspective of the one-party state, and a region which has become a huge laboratory. A huge laboratory, I mean, to test new methods of population control. If you want to understand, I mean, what a surveillance state can look like, you have to understand, to study, or to get interested in what's going on in Xinjiang. From checkpoints with facial recognition, regular scanning of phones to identify sensitive applications and contents, the systematic registration of kitchen knives, passport confiscation, as well as significant travel restrictions for those willing to leave not the country, not their province, their hometown. This is what we are talking about in Xinjiang. And obviously, with that element, I haven't said anything in the sense that many of you will have read, or those of you who followed, the Universal Periodic Review of China's human rights records back in October or November 2018, a number of states did raise a concern. By the way, a number of states did not raise any concern with regards to the opening of those so-called education and conversion centers. Education and conversion centers, which were first, denied, whose existence was first denied, by the party state, but then it became obvious that these re-education centers do exist, and the very idea, of those centers, which now bring, it's very difficult, obviously, you don't have official statistics on the number of Uyghurs who are currently forced into those re-education centers, but it would be between 1 million and 2 million people who have been put against their will in those so-called re-education centers. Re-education centers in which, the party state makes sure that those people do comply, are no threats to the party system. Re-education center in which, those people of different faiths, but very often coming from those minority groups, based in Xinjiang, have to deny their faith. In Islam and so on and so forth. We are really talking about deep re-education. Some of you may have seen that there has been a leak, which was reported by the New York Times 2 days ago. A leak of official party documents. We are talking about as many as 400 pages, in which it is made clear that, Uyghurs and people put in those re-education camps should be treated, I quote, without mercy. So this is literally what we are talking about in this region of Xinjiang today, just as yet another illustration of indeed this idea of fragmentation of Chinese citizenship. Then the last point which I would like to make here with regard to this internal dimension of Chinese citizenship is that the very contestation or the very advocacy in favor of those rights which are protected by the Chinese constitution, which are supposed to be linked to the idea of Chinese citizenship, so a contestation which you could describe as an act of citizenship, can actually lead to an even further fragmentation of Chinese citizenship of the same people who try to advocate in favor of those rights. And here I would like to make reference to a process which started more particularly in the night of the 9th of July 2015. The 9th of July 2015, which was the start of the 709 crackdown, as it now became well known, which is a crackdown more particularly against, human rights lawyers and lawyers in general. And we are actually talking about, as many as 265 lawyers who have been, temporarily or permanently detained, not for having done anything unlawful, but simply indeed because being too vocal in favor of some of those rights which are supposed to be linked to the very notion of Chinese citizenship. So we are here talking about a process which is still very much in the making, but just to say that indeed this very contestation, this very opposition to this fragmentation of Chinese citizenship can lead to an even stronger, fragmentation in the sense that those human rights lawyers are very often treated very often treated in ways which even do not comply with Chinese law. So through special procedures they have to go through, when being targeted by this specific process of repression. Do you have a question? Oh, sorry, I thought so. Now, what does it mean, for the rest of the world? This is happening in China, almost 1.5 billion people, so quite a big part of the world's population. But if we want to understand what this means for us from the perspective of the European Union, it is quite interesting to look at a process which you could call a transnational expansion of Chinese citizenship. A transnational expansion of Chinese citizenship which means that there is very much a departure in China from an understanding of citizenship which is based on what you could call sovereigntist territoriality, an idea of citizenship which is based on a certain territory, which is the one of the People's Republic of China. And when you think about it, this is something which makes sense, more particularly in a context in which China has had this long-standing tradition of emigration, right? I mean, you have Chinese immigrants, I mean, all over the world, from the US to Europe to Southeast Asia, and so on and so forth. And what we have seen, I mean, in the last few years are increasing attempts, I mean, for the party state to reach out, which also means to control, those who are defined as Chinese outside China's borders. Just one illustration of that, I mean, the Chinese immigration law does not recognize, I mean, dual citizenship. So if you are, let's say, if you were successful in getting a Belgian passport in addition to your Chinese passport, whenever you go back to China, you cannot use, according to the law, your Belgian passport. You will be Chinese according to the Chinese immigration law. Another, I mean, example, I mean, which does testify, I mean, of those attempts, I mean, to reach out to those being defined as Chinese outside China's border, is obviously in the context of this massive, I mean, anti-corruption campaign, which was very much launched by Xi Jinping back in 2013. I mean, corruption has been a long-standing problem in China. I mean, we didn't have to wait until the creation of the PRC in 1949 to see the emergence of corruption as a significant problem. Corruption was already very much there at the time of the last dynasty, the Qing dynasty. It was there, I mean, throughout the decades since the creation of the PRC back in 1949. But the least that we can say is that, I mean, corruption had become at a certain point a significant threat against, I mean, the very legitimacy of the party state. I mean, it is Hu Jintao, so the former Chinese president, who made it clear, I mean, a few years ago, it was around, I think, 2010, 2011, that if the party state was not able to address, I mean, the rampant corruption within Chinese society, that the very legitimacy of the party state would actually be impacted. Okay, so corruption, a very long-standing problem. But what we've seen, more particularly since 2013, is a massive fight against corruption. A massive fight against corruption, which has targeted hundreds of thousands of people, many of them being officials, people who have been targeted who were not only based within China, but also outside China. Indeed, a number of those people suspected of corruption tried to leave the country, try to escape in a certain way by living either in the US, in Southeast Asia, in Europe, and so on and so forth. And it is against this background that one should situate, I mean, this law enforcement fair, what you could call a law enforcement fair. I mean, attempts by China to enhance judicial cooperation mechanism with jurisdictions all over the world to make sure that there is no safe haven, that there is no place in the world where those economic fugitives, for many of them, political fugitives, for some of them, can actually hide. And this is something which President Xi Jinping made very clear back in 2014. He made it clear at the occasion of the plenum that we should punish corrupt officials with zero tolerance. We should bring them to justice, even if they flee to the farthest parts of the earth. We should never let them hide in the safe haven at large. So you really see here a very clear agenda to make sure that you can go back, that you can retrieve and bring back to trial, I mean, those people defined as Chinese who are suspected of being corrupt, or sometimes who are also obviously political dissidents. In terms of legal framework, I mean, China's extradition law is still based on a statute which was adopted back in 2000, but it is very clear that in the context of, I mean, those attempts to extradite, I mean, Chinese fugitives who would be based, I mean, in Southeast Asia, in Africa, in Europe, and so on and so forth, that China has to rely upon an increasing network of extradition treaties. And here, obviously, you have the question of Hong Kong, right, which is in the background, and I would be happy to go back to that at the time of the Q&A. I mean, the very idea of having extradition agreements has been very much debated in certain jurisdictions. I would like to mention Australia here, which is one of these places in the world where there was, I mean, very much a debate on the opportunity and risks that such an extradition agreement with China would entail. It took, I mean, a couple of years. And at a certain point, I mean, the Australian government came up to realize that they would never be successful in actually making this extradition agreement with China adopted by the Australian Parliament. So they decided to remove it, and we will hence not have any extradition agreement between Australia and the PRC. We have also seen a number of other jurisdictions, and I would like here to mention more particularly the case of New Zealand, in which we've seen that national courts have become increasingly active in blocking, I mean, extradition procedures to China. And I just would like here to, I mean, read some a very short abstract of a decision which was taken by the Court of Appeal of New Zealand back in June, 2019, a decision which blocked an extradition procedure to China for the very reason that there were cultural and systemic features of the PRC criminal justice system that question any kind of relevance which may be given by the Chinese government in terms of not applying the death penalty, in terms of not torturing the suspect, and so on and so forth, against the background, because there are many risks which are actually incurred by the suspect, from the risk of torture in a country where torture is illegal yet remains widespread, the existence of direct political influence in the criminal justice system, and the evidence of harassment and even persecution of criminal defense lawyers. I mean, the suspect here was one of those criminal defense lawyers. So it's quite interesting here to see at the different ways in which foreign courts, I mean, do assess the risks which may be encountered by those fugitives if they were to be extradited towards China, given the very weaknesses of the Chinese criminal justice system. I mean, it may come as a surprise, or it may not come as a surprise, but in sharp contrast with the situation in Australia, we hardly have any debate within the European Union. We hardly have any debate within the European Union on the opportunity or the risks to establish such an extradition agreement with China. As you can see here on this map, there are a number of EU member states who have agreed, who have adopted extradition treaties with China. You have Portugal, Spain, France, Italy, Romania, Bulgaria, Lithuania. And actually, I just would like to mention the fact that Belgium actually adopted a similar treaty back in November 2018, a treaty which is not yet enforced. And my guess in that regard is that the Belgian government finds it quite difficult to publicize such an agreement in the midst of a situation which is extremely complex in Hong Kong. So we see here an increasing number of states who have indeed, I mean, adopted those extradition agreements with China. Sweden, which doesn't have, I mean, an extradition treaty with China, I mean, has had, I mean, a procedure of extradition, because you can have a treaty, but you can also have ad hoc procedures of extraditions which are based on a case-by-case basis. And it's quite interesting to see in that regard that the highest court of Sweden made an important ruling in August 2019, blocking the extradition process of a Chinese citizen, because such an extradition would be in violation of Article 2, Article 3, and Article 5 of the European Convention on Human Rights. In a context where France, Spain, Portugal, Italy, Romania, Bulgaria, Lithuania are all members of all parties to the European Convention on Human Rights, it remains to be seen the extent to which there will be a kind of spillover effect. You had, I mean, an important decision which was taken by a court of appeal in France last month. Many thought that indeed the extradition would be blocked because of similar reservations in view of the European Convention on Human Rights. The court found a different trick to block the extradition, but it is likely that we will see, I mean, more such treaties or such extraditions blocked in the future. The last point which I would like to make here is that, I mean, having an extradition agreement with China does not impede China to repatriate some of its citizens using different means than the extradition treaty. I mean, there is a procedure which is very much used by China, which is called persuasion work. Persuasion work means what in practice? I mean, you send some policemen under a tourist visa to, for instance, an EU member state such as France. You find, I mean, one of those Chinese fugitives, and you persuade them to come back to the mainland to be trialed. I mean, there are different ways, obviously, to persuade someone. And the reason why I mentioned that is because, I mean, it was a little bit of a big surprise to France, I mean, 2 years ago, that indeed such a persuasion case had been taken place. So we had a Chinese fugitive, a former Chinese official, who was hiding in France. And at a certain point, there was an official communique from a specific commission in China saying, I mean, we were successful in persuading this official to go back to China. And then the French officials were there, but don't we have an extradition treaty? I mean, shouldn't we have applied indeed the provisions of the extradition agreement? So just to say that indeed having such an extradition treaty does not impede indeed the application of those extrajudicial repatriation, such as in the case of those so-called persuasion works. So this is what I wanted to tell you about this idea of Chinese citizenship. Chinese citizenship which is fragmented on the one side, and also Chinese citizenship which is increasingly expanding with all the implications which it can have from the perspective of human rights and from the perspective of the rule of law. As you could see, I haven't used those terms too much, but I guess that it is not too difficult for you to understand the human rights and the rule of law implications of the introduction of re-education camps in Xinjiang, or the rule of law and human rights implication of persuasion works, or the human rights and rule of law implications of extradition agreements. But we can obviously come back to that at the time of the discussion. Now, what about digital transformation? We are now moving towards a completely different world, the world of high tech. The world of high tech, which can also have, I mean, a significant impact on the rule of law and human rights, and the world of high tech and digital transformation, in which China is really trying to take the lead. So here, I just would like to say a few words, I mean, giving some details on the context in which this digital transformation is taking place in China, looking at the specific characteristics of this digital transformation, questioning the extent to which those digital transformation would have led to the emergence of a so-called surveillance state in China. We'll be talking a little bit about the social rating system in that context. And finally, I just would like to highlight the transnational implications from the perspective of the European Union. First of all, some facts. When we talk about digital transformation, I mean, we are talking about huge numbers when China is concerned. We are talking about a market made of as many as almost 800 million internet users. We are talking about a society where by 2025, 59% of total consumer spendings will be made via e-commerce, via the internet. We are talking about a number of state-owned or quasi-state-owned enterprises such as Huawei and ZTE Communications, who are about to become leaders in the development of who are about to become the largest 5G telecom suppliers. And finally, we are also talking about a number of Chinese unicorns who have moved from being university-based startups to becoming some of the most valuable artificial intelligence corporations. I'm mentioning here SenseTime, which is this Chinese unicorn who has become very well known for its development of facial recognition technologies. Facial recognition technologies, which have obviously a huge implications in terms of human rights, huge implications in terms of the protection of the rule of law. In terms of the context in which, I mean, those numbers have to be understood, I mean, it is very clear that there is a political vision. That there is a political vision behind this process of digital transformation. China adopted back in 2015, I mean, the so-called Made in China 2025, whose idea is to make clear that China has as a purpose to move more sophisticated parts of the value chain, high caliber research and development into China. There has been also the adoption of the new generation AI development plan back in 2017, where China makes it clear that China wants to lead the world in new trends in the development of AI, and so on and so forth. So we see here there is a real political vision. We are talking about a process which is very much supported, driven by the party state. And this actually leads me to the first, characteristic in a certain way of this digital transformation in China. That is that if you want to understand this digital transformation, it is very much important to understand how state control is combined with the marketization of this digital transformation. As very often, and that has been the case since the beginning of the opening up and reform process at the end of the 1970s, economic development has been as much based on state control as it has been based on marketization, on market forces. And this is something which is, again, pretty obvious. When you consider the digital transformation of China, in a certain way, you can talk about a state model of corporate capitalism. A state-driven model of corporate capitalism. Corporate capitalism in the sense that also in the context of Chinese economy, legal entities, so-called corporations, remain the main driving forces behind the development of, the Chinese economy. That being said, obviously this marketization is also, combined with a very strong level of state control. And this is particularly the case of companies such as Huawei. When you look Huawei, which is a company which has been discussed quite a lot in countries such as Canada, in countries such as the UK, because there was this idea of Huawei to be a front runner in the establishment of 5G technologies in those jurisdictions, in those economies. And the big question was what were the risks, from a national security perspective, in a context where from the outside, Huawei is very much perceived as being a state-owned enterprise, or an enterprise in which you have a significant influence of the state. When you look at the website of Huawei, it is mentioned that Huawei is actually owned by workers working for Huawei. When you dig a little bit, you see that Huawei is indeed owned by labor unions. But in a one-party state, when you are part of a labor union, is officially part of the state. So you see where you want to get. Where I want to get here. De facto, Huawei is a company which is owned by the state. So here we do see, a clear intertwinement in a certain way between market forces and state control. This is the first characteristic of this digital transformation. The second point which I would like to mention here, that is that if we want to understand, the digital transformation of China, it is very much important to understand, the tension between localization and globalization. When you think about datas, datas do not know borders, right? You now send an email to Beijing, it will be received in half a second. You do the same to the US. Datas do not know borders. And still, China has introduced, quite interestingly, back in 2016, this idea of cyberspace sovereignty. The fact that you should be able to apply, that you should be able to protect your cyberspace in line with the concept of sovereignty, in line with the value of sovereignty. In practice, what does that mean? It means that any personal information and important business data has to be localized, has to be stored in China. We are talking about data localization. We are talking about data localization. We are talking about cyberspace sovereignty. I will come back to that, but the big question is how does this work with Europe, where we have the GDPR, right? Where we have a very rights-based approach towards the protection of data. So again, here, you do see the clear rule of law and human rights implication of this digital transformation. Last but not least, importance of security and importance of social stability. I mean, security and social stability are also two important drivers of this digital transformation in China. If you want to understand, I mean, what is considered or what can be considered potentially as a cybersecurity threat or a national security threat, it is actually any digital information threatening social or political stability, which means that the scope is kind of high, right? I mean, if you want to understand the scope of, I mean, cybersecurity in China, I mean, the clear illustration of this permanent search for security and social stability relates to internet governance. I mean, it is clear that, I mean, you still have a number of websites which do remain blocked, I mean, in China, from the New York Times to any human rights NGO website you want to imagine. And you obviously still have, I mean, the importance of censorship with a great difficulty to identify the borderline between what's permitted and what's not allowed. And that's another point in where, I mean, China is changing quite tremendously. I mean, certain themes which were allowed, I mean, until a few years ago are now completely, I mean, considered as being extremely sensitive and therefore are heavily censored, I mean, on the internet. Not to say that, I mean, the internet is only seen as a threat, I mean, by the party state, I mean, in the sense that the internet also offers, I mean, a useful instrument for the propaganda, for spreading information from the perspective of the party state. And it's here quite interesting also to see, and we can go back to that at the time of the discussion, to see how Beijing is now using the internet, I mean, to describe what's going on in Hong Kong. So here again, you do see that indeed the internet, I mean, can be seen as a threat on the one side, but can also see the emergence of a number of opportunities. All those this digital transformation obviously takes place in a particular context. And I would like here to go back to those different arguments which I put forward at the beginning of my lecture, which do testify, which do illustrate what has been described as this authoritarian revival in China. So the point which I would like to make here is that all those aspects of this digital transformation which I have described here do have the potential to feed into the construction of a surveillance state. A surveillance state which is increasingly based on a very wide network of cameras, big data algorithms, and cloud storage. This is what we are talking about in contemporary China. I mean, the very fact that indeed all those technologies can be used for surveillance, for controlling purposes. I just would like to mention here this plan, which was established back in 2015, which is the so-called Sharp Eyes project. Sharp Eyes project, which has as a purpose to create a surveillance network all over China that would be omnipresent, fully networked, always working, and fully controllable by 2020. I'm not talking here, I'm talking here about an official document which was released back in 2015. And the question which I would like to raise here, and again, as you can see, I'm touching upon quite a number of issues here, but which hopefully, I mean, also link to knowledge you've built by reading academic articles on China, or also by looking at the press, at newspaper articles focusing on China. There is the question of where does this social credit system fits, I mean, in that whole context. I mean, in that whole context where we do see indeed, I mean, a number of ways in which, I mean, new surveillance techniques or surveillance techniques facilitated by technological developments are used within China. I mean, the first question which I would like to answer here is, are we talking about a real-life Black Mirror? Question mark. I don't know if many of you have seen this Black Mirror episode, which is called No Sadif, I think, which was in season 3, if I'm not mistaken, of Black Mirror, which is actually an episode of Black Mirror in which, I mean, every, I mean, social interaction you have with someone else will be rated. I mean, Kolya was kind enough to make a far too generous introduction at the beginning of the lecture. I would obviously give him a 5 stars, right? I mean, after the lecture. I had a terrible lunch with Marta today. I will only give her, 1 star. So there is very much this idea indeed of, rating every kind of social interaction that you would have. And actually when, the first newspaper articles on this social credit system were released by the press, more particularly in the West, there was the narrative. Oh, China is now creating this Orwellian society based on surveillance. We are talking about real life Black Mirror. My answer to that is no. This is not what we are talking about. It could potentially have the potential to become that one day, but this is not what we are talking about today. One important point. And second, it is clearly not the way it is perceived in China these days. I will come to that in a moment. So if you read, the official documents, aimed to establish this social credit system, there is this idea of establishing the idea of a sincerity culture, I quote, and carrying forward sincerity and traditional virtues. Nothing really about surveillance, about controlling your population in there, right? At the moment, actually, we are talking about a decentralized, and I insist on that fact, on a decentralized network of a number of governmental and commercial pilot schemes. If you want to understand what's going on in terms of this social rating system, we are not talking about something which is centralized yet, but we are talking about a number of pilot schemes run and driven by governments on the one side, and on the other side, driven by private companies. The first purpose, the initial purpose of most of these schemes, is to enhance the good functioning of the socialist market economy. So the original purpose of this social rating system is actually to make sure that, when you, just to take a basic example, when I buy something online that I do pay. And indeed, if I do not pay, then it will become more difficult for me to make a purchase on that online platform afterwards. So this is, in a certain way, what this social rating system is being made of from the early stages. That being said, let's not forget the context in which this social rating system is evolving, and let's not forget, the strong intention to centralize this system. In that sense, it is arguable that the social rating system has the potential to let those, and I quote here an article which was published back in 2017, to let those who have lost credit struggle to walk a single step, and let those who maintain credit reap benefits and gain respect. Not only in the market, in the social market economy, but obviously you can imagine the consequences which it can have in the context of a one-party state. Not only has China the ability to overcome the technological obstacles which stands between the situation we now know and a successful centralization of this system, but also secondly, it is clear that the party state does see the benefits of such a successful centralization. One of the points which I made at the beginning of this case study was that it's kind of interesting to look at the ways in which Chinese people do actually perceive this system of social rating system. This is a study which was conducted by the Freie Universität Berlin back in 2018, based on a sample of 2,200 internet-connected Chinese citizens. Now you can obviously criticize the methodology, criticize the very idea of having a research based on a sample in China, but still, for your information, with all those caveats added, 49% of the people who were part of that sample strongly approved the social credit system, 31% somewhat approve, and 19% neither approve nor disapprove. If I could ask you the question here, who would approve such a system? I guess that I would see all your hands raised. My second question would be, who is on Facebook and who is not on Facebook here? but we can again come back to that in the discussion afterwards. Now, last but not least, and then I reach, please?
Sorry, I didn't quite understand, because the way you described it, it looks like it's some sort of like an Amazon rating system. An Amazon rating system does not have effects outside of Amazon, does it? Because I read that this influence, for example, your ability to travel abroad.
Exactly.
Does it?
No, definitely no. You're extremely right here. I mean, the only it was just to provoke you a little bit when I talked about Facebook here. I mean, and then I come back directly to your question. I mean, the very point is that in Europe, I mean, we tend, to be extremely vocal when we know that governments, or that an authoritarian government would actually use our data, but at the same time, we are very keen to give up our data to a number of private corporations, I mean, Facebook being one of them. Now, to answer your question directly, I mean, no doubt that some of those pilot schemes, have been extremely detrimental. I mean, we are talking about double sentencing in certain instances. So some pilot schemes in certain cities would have seen, for instance, let's take an example. I mean, you've been fined by a tribunal, for having done something wrong, and then because of this pilot, social credit system in that particular city, you would not be able to register, your child in the good school, in that neighborhood. Or let's say that you are not a good payer, and then you are not allowed to travel, first class on the train to go to the neighboring city. So indeed, you have, huge implications which already exist. The only reason why, I do find it quite important to deconstruct the system as it stands is that, the way, the social rating system has been reported in the media, did tend to show, a system that would already be extremely centralized in a certain way, extremely well coordinated. And my point here is that we are not there yet. There is very much the potential for all those negative externalities which you have mentioned here to become systematically organized and systematically centralized in the context of the party state, which would obviously be even more problematic than the specific case that you've just mentioned here. Does that kind of answer your question? Yeah. Now, just, a few words, because I promised you at the beginning that I would not only look at developments within China, but also look at the transnational implications of, those two factors, namely fragmentation of Chinese citizenship on the one side and digital transformation on the other side. And the question here is, what does this digital transformation mean for Europe and for the European Union? The first point which I would like to make here is, from a GDPR, from a data protection rules, how can we reconcile? How can we reconcile the GDPR data privacy rules with, the way data protection or the management of data is foreseen by Chinese law these days? And when I refer to Chinese law, I'm referring here more particularly to the 2016 cybersecurity law, which imposes, this storage of data, within China. And the question is obviously here is, how can you reconcile, a system such as the GDPR, which is very much based on a rights-based approach, with the cybersecurity law, which is primarily based upon an idea of controlling data? How can you, as a European company active in China, or as a Chinese company active in the European Union, comply with both regulations? We are very likely to see conflicts of law here, conflicts of law which will not be driven only by the very provisions of these laws, but also conflicts of law which will be very much driven by the significant differences in terms of the very nature of the two legal systems. Second, aspect which is quite important to bear in mind. Those of you who are interested in European foreign investment law, you will know that in 2019 you had the adoption of a regulation by the European Union establishing foreign investment screening mechanism, a foreign investment screening mechanism which allows the European Commission to release non-binding opinions when, a foreign investment can potentially pose a threat to the national security or public order of more than one EU member state. So we are here talking about a vertical and horizontal coordination mechanism, which aims to better coordinate, the cooperation between EU institutions and EU member states when foreign investments are concerned, but also to have better mechanisms of horizontal cooperation between EU member states, with indeed this idea of the European Commission not having a veto right, but being able to release some opinions. When you read the regulation, it is very clear that China is in the background. Chinese investments in Europe are in the background, and in particular, Chinese investments in the digital economy are in the background. We are not talking here only about investments in critical digital infrastructure, such as 5G, but data protection is directly mentioned. So just to say that again here, there are some transnational implications of, this data protection regime or data controlling regime as it has been introduced in China. Last but not least, you also have what I would call the transnational implications of technological developments in the area of artificial intelligence. China has now become the leader in the development of facial recognition. The Chinese government now sells its facial recognition technologies to a number of states, including in Africa, a number of states where, both rule of law and human rights are not always strongly respected. The big question is, how do we make out of that? More particularly in a context in which, it has been made very clear by the President-elect of the European Commission that research and the EU's industrial policy in the area of the digital economy will be a significant focus of the European Commission. The question is what to do out of this digital transformation from the perspective of the European Union. Let's be clear, the EU is a little bit behind when technological developments in the field of artificial intelligence are concerned. So what the EU does, and here I would say it's kind of common practice, when we are standing behind something, what we do is that we develop standards and regulations. And here artificial intelligence is no exception. The EU is now trying to come up with its own understanding of what artificial intelligence and technological developments in the area of AI should look like. And the EU came up in that regard with, so-called ethical guidelines for a so-called, I quote, trustworthy artificial intelligence. Trustworthy artificial intelligence, which means that AI should be lawful, should be ethical, and to be honest, I don't really get the last one, but should also be robust, I quote. Now, it's quite interesting in that regard to see that, there is increasingly a dialogue, between the European Union and China when the ethical and I would say human rights implications, of artificial intelligence are concerned. In the context of the EU-China dialogue, we are not talking about the human rights implications, but ethical implications. But let's say that both dimensions are obviously clearly linked with each other. And I just would like to mention here, and I don't think it's an anecdote, but while the EU came up with its own guidelines, its own ethical guidelines, China also came up with its own ethical guidelines on artificial intelligence in the summer of 2019. So in that sense, I think there is really a need, to have a deep discussion on what those ethical implications can mean. This very topic was discussed in the context of the Legal Affairs Dialogue, which was established by the European Union and China back in 2015, and at the occasion of the 2018 Legal Affairs Dialogue, which aims to discuss differences, similarities, but also possibilities for more convergence between the European legal systems and the Chinese legal system. One of the main themes which was discussed back in 2018 in the context of that dialogue was indeed the ethical implications of artificial intelligence. The last point which I would like to mention here, just to convince you, hopefully, that indeed there are some transnational implications from the perspective of the EU. The next guidelines which are likely to be released by the European Commission in the months to come are likely to focus on facial recognition. So again, here I guess that we can see that China and those technological developments are in the background, and that there is an idea of looking at the implications of those technological developments from a more rights-based approach. And one point that I would like to mention here in that regard is that I've been very critical of a number of developments here, in the context of this lecture, and I've not made really links with events or situations occurring in other jurisdictions. Just 2 points which I would like to make here, just to show that indeed it's very important to add nuances to what I've said here. If you look at, the guidances which have been released in Xinjiang, by the Chinese government, guidances which also aimed at preventing terrorism and so on and so forth, you do see many links with, the PREVENT strategy, which was adopted by the United Kingdom a few years ago. You see there similar language. If you think about surveillance, you have surveillance everywhere, right? If you think about the United Kingdom, where I come from, where I work, you have also CCTV everywhere, right? But the very point which is important to bear in mind is that here we are talking about developments taking place in one particular context. In one particular context in which you do not have the checks and balances mechanisms which you will find in the UK, which you will find in Europe, and hence the importance of this overall context which I try to highlight at the beginning of my lecture. Conclusions, which will leave us 30 minutes for discussion. First point, China is changing internally, and externally, China is increasingly becoming a rule maker and a rule shaper. We've seen, how the rule of law and human rights linked to Chinese citizenship can be fragmented, looking at the household registration system, looking at the othering process which characterizes the distinction between different ethnic minorities, or looking at the even stronger fragmentation of rights linked to Chinese citizenship, which any kind of human rights advocacy or in favor of those rights linked to Chinese citizenship can actually lead to. We've also seen that those developments, that this fragmentation of Chinese citizenship can have an impact outside China's borders, and I've taken indeed the China's law enforcement fair as a kind of example here. Emphasizing how important it has become to China to reach out towards those citizens who are situated, who live outside China's territory in the context of, the fight against corruption. And we've seen that indeed this world digital transformation can obviously have a significant impact on those different developments. Now, 2 last points, to conclude. I guess that all those developments, do call for a reaction from the perspective of the European Union. In that regard, we've seen in the last few years that it has become increasingly difficult for the European Union to engage China in the area of norms promotion in line with Article 21 of the Treaty on the European Union. The EU and China have had a human rights dialogue since 1997. The dialogue is not in a good shape at all. The EU and China do have a legal affairs dialogue, which I mentioned, which can indeed, in which we see that a number of important issues such as digital transformation are discussed. But at the same time, we've also seen increasing difficulties of the European Union to speak with one voice when the promotion of the human rights and the rule of law are concerned. It was, if I'm not mistaken, back in 2017 that for the first time the EU was not able to come up with a joint statement before the UN Human Rights Council when China's own human rights record was concerned. There was indeed a Greek veto against the joint statement. It was the first time that such a statement could be made. We've also seen that EU member states were not on the same page when critiques against the 709 crackdown, which I also mentioned in this presentation, was concerned, with some EU member states supporting that statement, which was made before the UN Human Rights Council, and some other member states opposing the same statement. So here, both horizontal and vertical coherence within the European Union are really key for the promotion of those values. And here, I would still really very much hope that, we can still hope for a multi-layered engagement on human rights and the rule of law with China. There is important work which is done at the level of the United Nations. If you think about the rule of law, the United Nations does recognize that there is a diversity in terms of rule of law traditions all over the world. The United Nations nevertheless tell us, in the context of a resolution which was adopted by the UN General Assembly back in 2012, that human rights, the rule of law, and democracy are interlinked and closely intertwined. This is not only, a kind of framework which is useful, I think, to understand the difficulties which I have highlighted here in the context of China, but I believe that this is also a framework, this interlink, this intertwinement between democracy, the rule of law, and human rights, which can be useful also for us to understand a number of crises which are now occurring within the European Union, Hungary, Poland, Romania, and which make it increasingly difficult for the European Union to act as this so-called coherent actor when the promotion of norms, human rights, the rule of law, and democracy are concerned. Thank you very much for your attention. I did mention quite a number of things, so don't hesitate to come back to me with targeted questions, or even if you want to broaden up the debate even more, you don't hesitate to let me know. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthieu. Of course, we had a couple of reaction papers ready on to later, so please, reaction paper givers, feel also especially responsible for kicking off the debate, if you would like to. I open up the floor for you with your questions and comments. I see two in the back. Perhaps we start with you, and then we take a second question.
Well, thank you so much for such informative lecture. My question is not EU focused, but more Asia and Middle East focused. So, with respect to the human rights violations happening within China, a lot of countries have been quiet about it. Specifically, let's talk about two countries, Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. In July of this year, UN Human Rights Director wrote a letter to China talking about the ending of the mass detention in the camps. However, 37 countries, including Pakistan and China, wrote a letter to the UN.